Okay, so today I present on Thomas Scanlon's When Do Intentions Matter to Permissibility? Scanlon's response to Anscombe's defense of the doctrine of double effect. Before I move on, I'd like to make a few quick notes. There's not going to be a biographical sketch here because, I decided to dispense with that. The guy's still alive. I think he's a professor emeritus at Harvard. Tremendous philosopher. I've seen other papers of his in ethics and philosophy of law, but I must say that his writing is really difficult to follow, particularly for fledgling philosophers like yourself. It was difficult for me. I had to read this 3 times before I finally said to myself, you know what? I'm going to go read G. Anscombe's paper. Maybe that'll shed some light on what he's saying. Nope. That also turned out to be really difficult. And so I just want to tell you all that please don't write in this way. As much as possible, always just aim for very simple, clear prose. Okay, so let's move on. Let's get the show on the road, as they say. So what is the doctrine of double effect? Generally speaking, it is a principle in ethics in which the permissibility of an action depends on both a good and bad effect. That is to say that we're dealing now with an action that has both a good and bad effect, and it's in that weird gray area where it's hard to nail down a criticism of an action, right? Many of you have brought up examples in discussion boards about stealing. It's something like that. Stealing we think of as wrong, but there are certain instances where maybe, even though it's wrong, there's another good effect in that, say, stealing some medicine for your family, for a family member that really needs it, produces the good of saving that family member's life. So the doctrine of double effect is something that ethicists try to use to help analyze actions and help at least the rest of us see how we should gear our criticisms of such actions. Moving along, moreover, the principle acts as a guide in determining or explaining permissibility on the basis of whether the act was intended or merely foreseen. Now, there are a few things in the statement that are important that we need to unpack. One is that idea of permissibility, this concept of permissibility. Now, if you notice, often people think of moral claims as either being good or bad, right or wrong. Sometimes permissibility can mean those things, but often we're going to have situations where it's not so easy to determine one way or the other. So, based on other determinations, we then are able to understand an action as permissible or impermissible. The other thing to keep in mind here is this last part where it says whether the act was intended or merely foreseen. And is this last part that Scanlon took pains to make a distinction about intention, the concept of intention. Namely, he said it can be understood in a narrow sense and in a wide sense. In the narrow sense, he means more specifically by that intention can be understood the way we normally understand it, that someone thinks about and plans to do something, and then they go out and do it based on that plan, knowing exactly what the result would be. The merely foreseen part is the wider sense of intention, whereas the plan is not so specified. It's a little general, and the effects also vaguely known, but there nonetheless. I guess another way to understand the wide sense of intention is thinking about how we go on a drive home from work or after school, right? You have a plan, a path that you know that you want to take to get home, and then you do it. But it's kind of hazy because by the time you get home, you almost even don't recall how it is you got there. You don't even seem to really remember getting off at an exit, stopping at certain stoplights or lights, making left or right turns. None of that. So, in a way, that intention, your intention to drive home, is general. It's not quite so specific. Let's move on. Let's talk about the formulation of the doctrine of double effect. Now, I need to emphasize that any formulation of this doctrine is going to be a bit controversial because ethicists haven't settled on a precise way that everyone agrees upon for formulating the doctrine. But the book does a pretty good job of it. In the back, there's a glossary. And I've paraphrased this formulation from that version. So, without further ado, let us begin with some slight stops to explain things. Here we go. It is permissible to perform an action that foreseeably has both good and bad effects if... Now, I want to pause here because this little if right here, that's an abbreviation for a logical phrase meaning if and only if. It refers to statements that have conditions, right? And the statement on the left, that is the part that says it is permissible to perform an action, blah, 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 that on the left has certain conditions to be satisfied. And those conditions will be stated on the right, the ones that I'm about to list below. When you say if and only if, it means they are necessary and sufficient, meaning that those are the only conditions, and those conditions by themselves warrant the permissibility of some action that has both good and bad effects. So let's move on to those conditions. 1, the act itself, apart from its consequences, is not intrinsically immoral. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second right here once more because there's a familiar word to you, the word consequences. Now, you need to know that in philosophy, and in particular in ethics, the word consequences has no negative connotations. That is the way we seem to use it in our everyday speech, right? We'll say, hey, don't go out past curfew if you want to suffer the consequences, right? There's an idea that something bad will happen. That's not what we mean by consequences in philosophy. Consequences in philosophy has a much more benign meaning. It just means kind of a result or a logical result from something. So keep that in mind when you're reading these papers. Second, the agent does not intend the bad effect, either as a means or an end. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with means and ends talk, you probably have seen this before. So basically what means and ends are the means are literally, kind of the path to get you a certain result. The result is the end, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean end like something stops. It just means that's the intended result or just a result of something. 3, the good effect is not produced by means of the bad effect, right? So what that's getting at, and I guess it requires some talk of Anscombe's target for using the doctrine of double effect, is Mr. Truman, the president, who made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It should also be noted that when the bomb was dropped, the reasons given for it were so that it could stop the war. What's really problematic about this decision is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were both completely civilian targets. It was just meant as a scare tactic, kind of like a bullying by the U.S. of Japan to say, hey, you better stop what you're doing or look what's going to happen. Not just to these two cities, but your entire country and anybody else who gets in our way. Because if you remember, back then, the United States won the race to develop the ultimate weapon. And the fourth condition, the value of the good effect is sufficiently great to warrant causing the bad effect. Right? So, all of these taken together they stand as a complex condition, a four-part condition, if you will, for the permissibility of some action, even though that action will produce both good and bad effects. Now, in the case of Truman dropping the bomb, Anscombe argued that, the good effect wasn't necessarily produced by the means of killing civilians. In other words, using this doctrine, she believed that she shows that humans have a certain value, that their life is the most basic value that we should take into consideration. And we also have certain rules of engagement when it comes to war. And dropping these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki amounted to an act of terror, essentially. The United States was not justified in dropping those bombs on those targets because there were no military installations or strategic points that would help get the effect of ending the war. So, the value of the good, the ending of the war, is greatly diminished, and so it does not warrant the causing of the bad effect, does not warrant the killing of civilians. Moving along. Scanlon's analysis of the doctrine of double effect. Ultimately, Scanlon argues, by way of argument by example, those were all the weird examples that he wrote down, that the doctrine does not require a condition that invokes an agent's intentions in its formulation. In other words, the concept of permissibility, Scanlon claims, is sensitive to different types of intentionality. Further, and most important to Scanlon's view, intentions are secondary to the consequences of an action. Since this is the case, he thinks, intentions do not matter as much in the permissibility of the double effect of an action. Right? So, this basically means that Scanlon is hinting at possible bad use of the doctrine of double effect. Ironically, even though it's intended to show something important. And we'll get to that later. And last, he does, however, think that intentionality certainly warrants moral criticism of an action. So that is to say that even though he doesn't want to countenance intentions in his formulation of the double effect, it doesn't mean that an act is without any moral content. Right? So, again, if we don't appeal to someone's intentions, it doesn't take away the possibility that that person can be criticized, morally speaking, for their action. So what are the types of intention according to Scanlon? Well, intentions are either, one, they're predictive, right? Basically, you intend to do something, and it's partly because you can see the result. So, intentions are of that sort. Some intentions are expressive of certain attitudes. The book uses the example of dishonesty, right? As a matter of fact, it says, dishonesty is sometimes impermissible, and so these actions may be impermissible. Right? Again, if you notice, there's sort of a nodding to the context of any kind of situation. It's not taking a black and white, view of things. It's not that all instances of dishonesty are morally wrong or bad. It's that if there's a good and a bad effect, the permissibility is then adjusted. Expectations of other people are a type of intention. And that's where there's been a lot of talk in this literature regarding things or such concepts as promises, right? So when someone promises you something and then they go and do something else, it wasn't his intention after the fact that he had promised you something. It wasn't his intention to do something else that made the act wrong. It's the fact that he broke the promise. So there's sort of an initial intention that you create by engaging in certain acts that also mesh with the expectations of other people. And then lastly, certain intentions are certainly impermissible when they're made on the basis of some coercion. I call them coercive intentions here, and Scanlon calls them threats, straight out. You can see this, I think, most recently as an example with what was that guy's name? I think it was Harvey Weinstein, what have you, right? Where he said, well, I'll greenlight your movie to get made, but you have to have sex with me, right? So that's a coercive intention. Also, almost always impermissible. So let us turn to Scanlon's own words, maybe to get a better idea of what he's worried about. There's this quote. He says, and I put in the examples of, quote, rescue to and rescue/transplant do differ in that in the latter case, but not the former, the death of the one is seen as required in order for us to save the five. And this is an important point right here in his parentheses where he says morally required in order to make this permissible, not causally required in order to bring it about. In this respect, the explanation I have offered has some similarity with the principle of double effect. But in my explanation, this difference has nothing to do with intentions of the agents involved. Page 751. Okay, so to get a sense of what's going on here, when he's talking about morally required, and the example he's referring to, it's morally required to wait for the one who is going to die to first die before you can use that person's organs to save 5 other lives, right? Causally required is the other way around. It's the sort of the means justifies the ends type thinking, where you say, well, if we just kill this person and take his organs now, then we can save 5 people. He says, nah, that is bad. And again, we can say that without even having to appeal to the agent's intentions, just merely on the fact that someone did that. We take it as a given that you don't just cut up people and take their organs to save other people. Scanlon then does something that's really important. He distinguishes between 2 uses of the doctrine of double effect. First, there's the deliberative use of the doctrine. And this use says that for the consideration of reasons that count for or against an action. Right? That sounded weird, so let me say it again. Deliberative use of the doctrine for the consideration of the reasons that count for or against an action. Right? So, as the name implies, deliberative use means you're putting some forethought into your action. There's going to be a plan for or against an action. And in that planning, you will also consider any possible effects, both good and bad, to help you determine what's the best way to go about something. The other use, and before I go on, this first use you also have to determine is also taking time into consideration, right? It's something that happens before you commit the act. But then there's the doctrine of the double effect that is used in a way to assess what has already happened. Or, as it states here, critical use of the doctrine to assess what an agent, quote, saw as reasons for acting the way they did. Right? So, in one sense, the first sense, you're using it as a prescriptive tool, kind of as a doctrine to help guide you in the thinking of what should I do. In the second use of the doctrine, we see that it's more a descriptive thing, something aimed at merely explaining what happened. And when it comes to moral criticism, often we want to be able to know how to cut that pie, right? I mean, it's not always clear. Moral criticism can be drawn in both cases, and maybe in the first case, it could actually prevent an action altogether. But in the second case, it's already too late. Something happened. And, well, it's too late. Now we just have to learn from it and move forward. The recourse to an agent's intentions, beliefs about an action can run afoul of any notions that we may have of permissibility and moral criticism. Hence, Scanlon believes it is better for us to avoid reference to intentions in the doctrine of double effect. The main point here being that Scanlon is worried about a situation where someone who definitely has ill intent and commits some action, but that action turns out to maybe be perceived as good by those around him, and then that person gets moral praise. Here I'm thinking of examples like, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Taxi, it's just Taxi, starring Robert De Niro, but he plays a deranged character who is obsessed with this model. And so he decides that he's going to murder this model and sets up a whole plan, deliberates on what to do, how to do it, doesn't care what happens to him. He wants to kill her. And then suddenly, at the end, when he's about to do it, somebody else gets in the way and has, I guess, a similar idea as him. And so he kills that person. And then everybody thinks he's the hero. Right? That would be fundamentally wrong. And that, I think, is Scanlon's worry about having intentions embedded in the doctrine of double effect.